The moment a client stops trusting your company, the paperwork stops mattering. Rain rolled heavily across the towering glass windows of Halbrecht Capital's Manhattan headquarters, while gray February clouds buried the skyline beneath cold afternoon light and restless wind sweeping over the Hudson River below. Inside the executive acquisition suite on the 43rd floor, more than 30 attorneys, analysts, and corporate officers sat beneath dim recessed lighting surrounding a polished walnut conference table, while a live Zoom negotiation connected New York, London, and Chicago across 3 massive wall screens glowing softly against the dark conference room walls. $180 million sat waiting inside the final execution package spread neatly across the table in front of me, while legal binders, compliance summaries, and governance certifications rested beneath the pale conference lighting. 23 years inside institutional acquisition strategy had taught me something younger executives rarely understand until consequences arrive publicly. Enterprise clients do not sign contracts because executives sound confident. They sign because someone trustworthy stands quietly behind the structure protecting the agreement. Across the table, Chief Operating Officer Daniel Cross adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit jacket, while speaking confidently toward the giant Zoom screens displaying Sterling Vale International's executive leadership teams, joining remotely from London beneath soft office lighting. Daniel looked exactly like the kind of executive investors usually loved immediately. Young enough to appear modern, aggressive enough to sound ambitious, smooth enough to believe presentation energy could replace institutional credibility. Unfortunately for him, legal departments care far more about stability than charisma. Today represents the beginning of a transformative partnership, Daniel announced proudly while acquisition projections illuminated the conference room walls behind him in pale blue light. Around the table, analysts nodded carefully while legal teams continued reviewing execution summaries across glowing laptop screens. Across the Zoom call, however, Sterling Vale's senior attorneys remained unusually quiet. Experienced legal teams always notice tension before executives do. They understand that acquisition structures become most fragile during the final hours before execution. Beside me, 2 younger associates whispered softly beneath the dim lighting, while rain streaked steadily down the windows overlooking lower Manhattan far below. Daniel continued speaking confidently toward the screens while discussing modernization strategies and future operational restructuring. There it was again. Executive language designed for shareholder presentations instead of client reassurance. Across the Zoom screens, Sterling Vale's leadership remained polite, but emotionally unreadable beneath the pale London office lighting. Then Daniel shifted the meeting suddenly. As part of our post-acquisition restructuring initiative, he announced smoothly, we are also transitioning legacy strategic leadership into retirement phases moving forward. Several attorneys inside the room stopped typing instantly. I lifted my eyes slowly from the governance binder resting open before me, while rain tapped softly against the towering windows overlooking the dark river beyond Manhattan. Daniel smiled confidently toward the conference screens without understanding the atmosphere inside the room had already changed. Vivian Mercer's role with Halbrecht Capital concludes effective immediately following today's execution review. Silence swallowed the conference suite completely. Not normal silence. Dangerous silence. Across the Zoom screens, Sterling Vale's legal division exchanged quick glances while one older British attorney slowly removed his glasses beneath the soft office lighting visible through the camera feed. Around the walnut conference table, younger analysts looked downward while senior compliance officers suddenly appeared deeply interested in the paperwork before them. Nobody interrupted Daniel because corporate humiliation always freezes rooms before consequences arrive. Daniel folded his hands confidently beneath the glowing wall screens while rain continued sliding across the skyscraper glass. Surrounding the conference suite, our next-generation leadership structure will strengthen future acquisition agility moving forward, he continued smoothly. Younger leadership. Interesting phrase considering most executives inside this building still required legal departments translating enforceability language during quarterly governance reviews. I closed the authorization binder carefully while the room remained completely silent around me beneath the cold recessed lighting. No anger. No public reaction. Older women become very dangerous once they stop needing executive approval to protect their dignity. Daniel finally turned toward me directly across the long conference table. Human Resources will coordinate your transition package after the call concludes. Across the Zoom screens, Sterling Vale's leadership remained silent beneath pale London lighting, while rain hammered softly against Manhattan's skyline outside. Then I spoke quietly enough that every person inside the room leaned forward automatically. "Then before you proceed with execution authorization," I said calmly while resting one hand lightly against the binder, "you should probably review Section 11 regarding strategic continuity certification." For the first time during the entire acquisition call, Daniel Cross stopped smiling. Rain continued hammering against the towering glass windows of Halbrecht Capital long after Vivian Mercer mentioned Section 11 beneath the cold recessed lighting of the executive acquisition suite. Around the polished walnut conference table, nobody moved immediately. Not the attorneys. Not the analysts. Not even the Sterling Vale executives appearing across the giant Zoom screens glowing softly against the dark conference room walls. Daniel Cross stood motionless beside the presentation monitors while the confidence draining slowly from his expression became visible beneath the pale blue light reflecting across the room. One older attorney from Sterling Vale finally leaned closer toward the camera from the London office visible across the screens. "Could Halbrecht Legal clarify the continuity certification language before execution proceeds?" he asked. Calmly. There it was. The exact moment the acquisition stopped belonging to Daniel. Across the conference suite, younger analysts lowered their eyes toward laptops while several senior attorneys quietly opened printed governance binders beneath the dim overhead lighting. Daniel forced a tight smile toward the Zoom screens. "The matter is procedural only," he replied smoothly. "Our internal legal teams can finalize clarification after the meeting." But the British attorney did not nod. Instead, he adjusted his glasses slowly beneath the pale London office lighting. "Respectfully," he answered carefully, "Sterling Vale's board requires immediate confirmation regarding strategic continuity oversight before signatures move forward." Silence settled across the room again. Heavier now. Around the table, Halbrecht's legal department had already started understanding something executives never noticed until collapse arrived publicly. Vivian Mercer had not been managing paperwork. She had been protecting enforceability itself. I closed the final authorization binder quietly while rain rolled down the giant windows overlooking lower Manhattan and the dark Hudson River beyond the skyline. No anger. No public embarrassment. People expecting older women to react emotionally after humiliation usually misunderstand where real leverage lives. Daniel finally turned toward Halbrecht's general counsel seated halfway down the conference table beneath the glowing screens. "Can legal confirm the continuity structure remains valid?" The attorney hesitated far too long before answering. Every person inside the room noticed it immediately. "We should review the language internally before execution," she replied carefully. Across the Zoom screens, Sterling Vale's executives exchanged subtle glances, while one compliance director quietly muted his microphone beneath the soft office lighting in London. Clients always notice instability before companies admit it exists. Around 8:30 that evening, the live execution call officially adjourned without signatures for the first time in 6 months of acquisition negotiations. Publicly, nothing appeared wrong yet. No media leaks. No investor panic. No market instability. But inside Halbrecht Capital's executive floors overlooking the rain-covered Manhattan skyline, emergency legal reviews began almost immediately beneath glowing conference room lights and untouched catering trays scattered across polished tables. Younger associates rushed between offices carrying governance binders, while exhausted attorneys reopened continuity documentation many executives clearly never bothered reading before tonight. Around 10:15, Daniel entered the primary legal review suite carrying a tablet beneath one arm, while rain streaked against the skyscraper glass surrounding the building. "Tell me exactly what Section 11 does," he demanded sharply. One older compliance attorney removed his glasses slowly before answering beneath the cold fluorescent lighting. "Section 11 ties strategic enforceability certification to lead acquisition continuity authority." Daniel frowned impatiently. "Meaning?" The attorney looked directly toward him now. "Meaning Vivian Mercer's removal may have invalidated final execution authority." Nobody inside the room spoke afterward, because deep down every attorney already understood the terrifying truth hidden beneath 23 years of invisible governance work. Halbrecht Capital had not delayed the acquisition because of a technical mistake. They had publicly humiliated the one person Sterling Vale trusted to certify the integrity of the deal itself. Thursday morning arrived beneath dark gray skies while cold rain washed across Manhattan's financial district and reflected against the towering glass exterior of Halbrecht Capital, overlooking the Hudson River. Inside the executive legal floors, however, nobody cared about the weather anymore. Overnight reviews of Section 11 had transformed quiet concern into full institutional panic beneath glowing conference room lights, scattered compliance binders, and exhausted attorneys carrying governance files between offices since before sunrise. The $180 million acquisition remained completely frozen, while Sterling Vale's legal division refused to resume execution discussions until continuity certification issues were resolved formally. Around 7:30 that morning, Halbrecht's general counsel entered the primary governance suite carrying a thick black binder beneath one arm while Daniel Cross stood near the giant windows overlooking the rain-covered skyline below. Several board representatives already occupied seats around the walnut conference table beneath dim recessed lighting while younger associates projected acquisition language across massive wall displays glowing pale blue against the dark room. "We completed the overnight continuity review," the general counsel announced carefully while opening the binder. Nobody interrupted her because everyone inside the room already sensed the answer would be bad. Section 11 established Vivian Mercer as the lead strategic continuity certifier for the Sterling Vale acquisition. Daniel folded his arms tightly beneath the cold conference lighting. "That does not explain why execution stopped." The attorney looked directly toward him now. "Because the certification chain requires active continuity oversight through final execution." Silence swallowed the room instantly. One older board member leaned forward slowly across the polished table. "Meaning?" The general counsel hesitated only briefly. "Meaning Vivian Mercer's public termination during live execution review may have invalidated institutional enforceability under Sterling Vale's governance requirements." Across the room, nobody spoke afterward. Rain streaked heavily down the giant windows surrounding the conference suite, while Manhattan disappeared beneath gray clouds and cold morning fog outside. Several younger associates quietly lowered their eyes toward laptops because even they understood what the executives finally realized too late. Sterling Vale did not trust Halbrecht Capital's presentations. They trusted Vivian Mercer's oversight personally. Meanwhile, across the Hudson River, soft morning light filled my apartment while ferries moved slowly through the rain beneath the dark Manhattan skyline beyond the windows. Warm coffee rested untouched beside several acquisition binders spread neatly across the dining table, while my phone vibrated steadily with calls from recruiters, attorneys, and financial analysts throughout the morning. Funny how corporations spend decades ignoring institutional knowledge until clients refuse moving forward without it. Around 9:15, one of Sterling Vale's senior legal directors contacted me privately from London beneath the soft office lighting visible through the video screen. "Mrs. Mercer," he began carefully, "our board would appreciate clarification regarding continuity certification authority." Interesting. Not Halbrecht leadership. Not Daniel Cross. The client itself reached out directly. I remained calm while rain drifted softly across the Hudson River outside the apartment windows. The acquisition structure was designed to preserve institutional continuity during final execution phases, I answered quietly. The attorney nodded once beneath the pale London lighting. "And removing you publicly disrupted that continuity?" I paused briefly before answering because legal truth rarely requires emotional exaggeration. The structure responded exactly as it was designed to respond. Across Manhattan, meanwhile, Halbrecht's executive leadership entered another emergency governance meeting beneath fluorescent lighting and exhausted silence, while investors began quietly requesting status updates regarding unexplained delays in the Sterling Vale acquisition. Around noon, the final blow arrived. Sterling Vale formally suspended all execution activity pending external governance reassessment and requested future negotiations include Vivian Mercer specifically. Inside Halbrecht's executive conference suite, nobody moved for several seconds after reading the notice projected across the massive wall screens. Then one older board director finally spoke the truth nobody wanted said aloud. The client trusted her more than this company. And deep down, every person inside the room understood exactly why. By Thursday evening, The atmosphere inside Halbrecht Capital no longer resembled the confident financial empire investors normally admired across Lower Manhattan. The towering glass headquarters overlooking the Hudson River remained brightly illuminated beneath cold rain and dark winter clouds, but inside the executive floors, tension spread through every conference room, hallway, and legal office beneath exhausted faces and glowing monitor screens displaying suspended acquisition timelines. The $180 million Sterling Vale acquisition had officially entered indefinite governance review, while institutional shareholders quietly demanded explanations from leadership regarding unexpected execution instability. Publicly, Halbrecht still claimed negotiations remained active. Privately, the company had started losing something far more dangerous than money: credibility. Around 6 o'clock, Daniel Cross entered the executive strategy suite carrying investor briefing documents beneath one arm, while several board members reviewed emergency governance summaries around the massive walnut conference table. Rain reflected against the skyscraper glass surrounding the room while the Manhattan skyline shimmered gray beyond the dark river below. Nobody greeted Daniel when he entered. That alone told him everything. One older board director finally looked up from the report spread across the table beneath dim recessed lighting. How many acquisition structures depended directly on Vivian Mercer's continuity certification? Daniel hesitated briefly before answering. I assumed legal teams handled the operational details. Across the room, Halbrecht's general counsel closed one of the binders slowly. That assumption may cost this company more than the Sterling Vale deal. Silence settled heavily across the conference suite, because everyone present already understood the truth. Vivian Mercer had spent 23 years quietly becoming the person enterprise clients trusted most inside Halbrecht Capital, while younger executives focused on presentation optics and modernization speeches. Meanwhile, across the Hudson River, warm apartment light reflected softly against dark hardwood floors, while I reviewed archived acquisition summaries beside rain-covered windows overlooking Manhattan beyond the black water. Each binder spread across the dining table represented years of negotiations most executives barely remembered anymore. Oil infrastructure, mergers in Dallas, international logistics expansions in Singapore, healthcare compliance acquisitions in Chicago. During every crisis, clients requested the same thing quietly behind closed doors. Can Vivian Mercer oversee final certification? Funny how corporations reduce women to administrative support, while billion-dollar clients treat them like institutional insurance policies. Around 7:30 that evening, my phone vibrated again. This time from an executive recruiter representing Armitage Global Strategies, one of Halbrecht's largest competitors headquartered in Boston. The recruiter's tone remained professional but direct. Several enterprise clients specifically associate your oversight with acquisition stability, he explained carefully. Of course they did. Trust built over decades does not disappear because one younger executive humiliates you publicly during a Zoom call. Across Manhattan, meanwhile, legal departments inside Halbrecht continued reviewing old acquisition records beneath cold fluorescent lighting, while rain hammered against the giant windows surrounding the building. One younger associate discovered something particularly damaging shortly before 9 o'clock. Vivian Mercer's continuity certification appeared attached not only to Sterling Vale, but to 6 previous acquisitions successfully completed during periods of executive instability. Inside the legal review suite, several exhausted attorneys exchanged long silent glances beneath the pale monitor glow after reading the documentation. One finally whispered the sentence nobody inside Halbrecht wanted becoming public. She was the reason these clients stayed calm during negotiations. Upstairs, investors had already started requesting emergency governance clarification calls while rumors spread quietly through Wall Street acquisition circles regarding leadership instability at Halbrecht Capital. The company still stood physically. The lights still glowed across Manhattan's skyline. But beneath the polished presentations and expensive conference rooms, something fundamental had started cracking apart. People were no longer questioning Vivian Mercer's value. They were questioning whether Halbrecht Capital ever understood it at all. Friday morning arrived beneath pale gray skies while freezing rain drifted across Manhattan and reflected against the dark glass towers surrounding Halbrecht Capital's headquarters near the Hudson River. Inside the company, however, the atmosphere had shifted from panic into quiet deterioration beneath exhausted legal teams, emergency governance calls, and conference rooms filled with executives pretending control still existed. The Sterling Vale acquisition remained indefinitely suspended, while institutional shareholders demanded formal explanations regarding continuity failures spreading through Wall Street acquisition circles faster than Halbrecht leadership could contain them. Around 8:30 that morning, several younger analysts arrived to discover two senior acquisition associates had already resigned overnight. Neither departure mentioned compensation. Neither mentioned workload. Both resignation letters referenced leadership instability during governance execution. Inside the executive legal suite overlooking the rain-covered skyline, Halbrecht's board gathered again beneath dim recessed lighting while fresh investor reports projected across giant wall displays glowing blue against the conference room walls. Daniel Cross sat quietly this time near the far end of the walnut table, while attorneys reviewed updated risk exposure summaries beside untouched coffee cups and stacks of governance binders. Nobody asked Daniel for strategic direction anymore. That alone unsettled him more than the acquisition freeze itself. One board member finally spoke while rain tapped softly against the skyscraper windows surrounding the room. Sterling Vale's legal division has postponed all execution timelines indefinitely. Another director slid a printed report across the table beneath the cold lighting. And two additional enterprise clients requested continuity clarification reviews this morning. Daniel stared downward at the paperwork without speaking. For the first time since the live call, he appeared less like a confident executive and more like a man slowly realizing institutional trust cannot be rebuilt through presentations once credibility collapses publicly. Meanwhile, across the Hudson River, warm sunlight briefly pushed through heavy clouds while I sat inside a quiet waterfront restaurant in Hoboken reviewing governance summaries with two senior partners from Armitage Global Strategies beneath soft amber lighting and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan beyond the dark water. Unlike Halbrecht executives, Armitage leadership did not waste time discussing optics or generational branding. They asked about infrastructure resilience, client continuity psychology, governance stabilization during executive transitions, real enterprise questions. One of the partners folded his hands calmly across the polished table. Sterling Vale trusted your oversight more than Halbrecht's leadership structure, he observed quietly. I almost smiled. Clients trust consistency, I answered while ferries moved slowly across the river outside the restaurant windows. Most companies noticed that too late. Across Manhattan, meanwhile, Halbrecht's internal situation continued worsening beneath glowing conference room lights and mounting investor pressure. Shortly after noon, financial media outlets quietly began reporting rumors regarding instability surrounding the suspended Sterling Vale acquisition. No names yet. No public scandal. But Wall Street understands coded language very well. Governance concerns. Leadership restructuring complications. Continuity certification delays. Investors hear those phrases and immediately smell institutional weakness. Around 2 o'clock, Halbrecht's general counsel privately informed the board that Sterling Vale executives specifically requested Vivian Mercer's participation before any future negotiation activity resumed. The room reportedly fell completely silent afterward beneath the pale fluorescent lighting of the executive suite. One older board director finally removed his glasses slowly before speaking. The client is choosing her over this company. Nobody argued because the truth had become impossible to ignore now. Vivian Mercer was no longer the executive Halbrecht publicly humiliated during a live acquisition call. She had become the standard clients measured the company against. And every hour that passed without her quietly pushed trust farther away from Halbrecht Capital's glass towers and closer toward wherever Vivian Mercer decided to go next. By Monday morning, the rain had finally stopped over Manhattan, but the atmosphere inside Halbrecht Capital remained colder than the gray winter skyline surrounding the financial district. News regarding the stalled Sterling Vale acquisition had spread quietly through enterprise finance circles all weekend while investors, legal advisors, and institutional clients waited for leadership to explain why one of Wall Street's most anticipated acquisitions suddenly entered governance paralysis days before execution. Inside the executive floors overlooking the Hudson River, conference rooms glowed beneath fluorescent lighting, while exhausted attorneys continued reviewing continuity documentation nobody outside legal departments had respected before Vivian Mercer walked away. Around 8 o'clock, Halbrecht's board assembled again inside the executive governance suite, while pale morning light reflected against the towering skyscraper windows surrounding the room. Daniel Cross entered carrying updated investor reports beneath one arm, but this time nobody looked toward him for reassurance. The room had already shifted emotionally beyond recovery. One board director spoke before Daniel even reached his chair. Sterling Vale formally declined our revised execution proposal. Silence settled across the walnut conference table, while governance summaries glowed across the massive wall displays. Another director slid a printed document forward beneath the cold recessed lighting. They requested future acquisition discussions occur through Armitage Global Strategies instead. Daniel froze completely. Across the room, Halbrecht's general counsel removed her glasses slowly while several younger associates exchanged exhausted glances over laptop screens. Everyone understood the meaning immediately. The client had not simply paused negotiations. Sterling Vale had started moving the acquisition away from Halbrecht entirely. Meanwhile, across the Hudson River, sunlight reflected softly against the water outside Armitage Global's temporary Manhattan strategy office, where warm amber lighting replaced the cold fluorescent atmosphere Halbrecht executives had lived beneath all weekend. Inside the conference room, I reviewed revised governance structures beside senior Armitage partners, while Manhattan's skyline stretched across the windows beyond the river. Sterling Vale's legal directors joined remotely from London beneath calm office lighting, while compliance teams discussed continuity integration timelines with quiet confidence. No panique. No scrambling. Just stability. One Sterling Vale executive finally smiled faintly through the screen. This feels significantly more organized already. That sentence alone explained why Halbrecht had started collapsing internally. Enterprise clients do not remain loyal to logos. They remain loyal to people making billion-dollar decisions feel stable under pressure. Around noon, Halbrecht's Investor Relations Department received notification that 2 institutional shareholders planned reducing exposure until governance confidence improved. Financial media outlets quickly amplified the story across Wall Street by early afternoon. Leadership concerns. Continuity failures. Institutional instability. The language remained careful, but the damage had already become visible publicly now. Inside Halbrecht's headquarters, several senior acquisition associates quietly began updating resumes beneath the pale office lighting, while executive elevators moved almost silently between floors once filled with aggressive confidence and expansion speeches. Shortly before 3 o'clock, Daniel Cross finally contacted me directly for the first time since the live termination call. His voice sounded lower now. Slower. Like someone learning too late that leadership titles cannot force trust to remain once credibility leaves the room. Vivian, he said carefully through the phone, Sterling Vale is restructuring the acquisition around Armitage. I remained calm while sunlight reflected across the Hudson River outside the office windows. Clients prefer continuity during uncertainty, I answered. Quietly. Silence stretched between us for several seconds before Daniel spoke again. I underestimated your role here. Outside the windows, ferries moved slowly through the cold afternoon water, while Manhattan shimmered beneath pale winter sunlight beyond the skyline. No, irraplia sufli. You underestimated what trust looks like when it is built over 23 years instead of one presentation. Wednesday evening settled over Manhattan beneath pale winter clouds, while the towering glass buildings surrounding the financial district reflected gold across the Hudson River under fading sunset light. Inside Halbrecht Capital, however, the atmosphere had become painfully quiet beneath dim executive lighting, half-empty conference rooms, and legal teams avoiding eye contact in elevators once crowded with aggressive confidence and expansion speeches. 3 days earlier, Daniel Cross still believed removing Vivian Mercer during a live execution call represented modernization. Now the company's most important acquisition had shifted toward a rival firm, while investors questioned leadership competence publicly across financial media networks and enterprise governance forums. Around 6:30 that evening, Halbrecht's board convened inside the executive governance suite overlooking Lower Manhattan, while updated investor exposure reports glowed across massive wall displays beneath cold recessed lighting. Daniel sat alone near the end of the polished walnut table, while several directors reviewed resignation notices from senior acquisition associates, who quietly departed during the past 48 hours. Nobody mentioned restructuring anymore. Nobody discussed modernization strategies either. The room had evolved beyond those conversations. One older board member finally folded his hands together beneath the pale conference lighting. Sterling Vale finalized preliminary transition discussions with Armitage this afternoon. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the reports scattered across the table. Across the room, Halbrecht's general counsel spoke carefully while rain began drifting lightly against the skyscraper windows overlooking the darkening river below. They specifically cited continuity confidence and governance stability. That phrase settled heavily through the conference suite because everyone understood what it truly meant now. Sterling Vale no longer viewed Halbrecht Capital as institutionally reliable. The company had publicly humiliated the one executive clients associated with operational trust itself. Meanwhile, across the Hudson River, warm light filled Armitage Global's Manhattan offices where calm conversations replaced the exhausted panic-consuming Halbrecht's executive floors. Inside a conference suite overlooking the skyline, I reviewed revised acquisition structures beside Sterling Vale's legal teams, while snow mixed lightly with rain beyond the windows facing lower Manhattan. One younger compliance attorney smiled faintly while organizing the execution summaries across the polished table. "This process feels stable again," she admitted quietly. I nodded once because enterprise negotiations always reveal the emotional condition of leadership eventually. Chaos inside companies spreads into contracts faster than executives realize. Around 8 o'clock that evening, Halbrecht's internal governance investigation formally concluded its preliminary review regarding the failed acquisition execution. The findings remained confidential, but rumors moved quickly through Manhattan finance circles before midnight. Daniel Cross reportedly ignored legal advisories regarding continuity oversight. Several board members privately questioned whether leadership vanity caused avoidable institutional damage, worth hundreds of millions in long-term client trust exposure. Inside Halbrecht headquarters, younger associates whispered quietly near elevators and darkened workstations while rain reflected silver against the giant windows surrounding the executive floors. For the first time in years, people inside the company had stopped talking about growth. They started talking about survival instead. Shortly before 9:30, Daniel Cross arrived outside Armitage Global's offices alone beneath cold rain and glowing streetlights reflecting across wet Manhattan sidewalks. He looked exhausted now, older somehow after only 1 week. The receptionist guided him silently toward the private conference suite overlooking the river, while snow drifted softly beyond the glass skyline outside. When I entered the room several minutes later, Daniel remained standing beside the windows watching ferries move across the dark Hudson River beneath the glowing Manhattan lights. "The board is forcing my resignation review," he admitted quietly without turning around. I remained calm while warm office light reflected across the polished conference table between us. "Executives survive failed deals all the time," I answered softly. Daniel finally faced me beneath the dim lighting. "Then why did this destroy everything?" Outside the windows, rain mixed with snow across the skyline while Manhattan shimmered cold and distant beyond the river. "Because," I said quietly, "you thought authority came from the title on your office door." Silence settled between us while the city glowed beyond the glass. But clients trusted the person protecting them when leadership failed. 2 weeks later, early March sunlight reflected across the Hudson River, while Manhattan finally emerged from winter storms beneath pale blue skies and cold golden light stretching across the financial district. Inside Armitage Global's executive offices overlooking lower Manhattan, the atmosphere felt calm again beneath warm recessed lighting, organized conference rooms, and quiet conversations replacing the exhausted panic that consumed Halbrecht Capital only days earlier. The Sterling Vale acquisition had officially resumed under Armitage's governance structure, while institutional investors praised the transition as stabilizing leadership continuity, across financial media reports spreading steadily through Wall Street circles. Nobody publicly mentioned Vivian Mercer directly. They did not need to. Enterprise finance understood exactly what happened. Around 9:30 that morning, Sterling Vale's final execution meeting began inside Armitage's primary acquisition suite, while London legal teams appeared across giant wall screens glowing softly against dark wood-paneled walls. Warm coffee rested beside organized governance binders while compliance officers reviewed the final certification chain beneath calm office lighting. No emergency legal reviews. No frantic executive meetings. Just structure operating correctly again. One senior Sterling Vale attorney smiled faintly through the Zoom screen before signatures began. This process feels remarkably different from 2 weeks ago. Across the polished conference table, several Armitage executives exchanged quiet glances, while sunlight reflected softly against the Manhattan skyline beyond the towering windows. Stability changes rooms immediately. Around noon, the acquisition officially closed beneath unanimous board approval and final institutional certification. The same $180 million deal Halbrecht Capital destroyed publicly during a live call now moved forward successfully under different leadership. Across Wall Street, the story spread quietly but quickly. Not as scandal, as warning. Younger executives obsessed with optics had publicly removed the one-woman enterprise clients trusted most and watched institutional credibility walk directly into a competitor's office. Meanwhile, across Lower Manhattan, Halbrecht Capital's headquarters still towered over the financial district beneath bright spring sunlight reflecting against the skyscraper glass. But inside the building, entire floors felt emptier now. 3 additional acquisition directors resigned during the previous week, while investors continued pressuring the board regarding governance restructuring and leadership accountability. Daniel Cross officially remained employed, but his authority had quietly collapsed beneath layers of board supervision, investor distrust, and internal legal scrutiny. Titles survive much longer than credibility does. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, Daniel requested one final private meeting at a quiet waterfront cafe facing the Hudson River beneath pale afternoon sunlight and slow-moving ferries crossing between Manhattan and New Jersey. When I arrived, he already sat near the windows staring silently toward the skyline beyond the water. He looked calmer now. Not confident. Just tired in the way people become after finally understanding consequences no presentation can reverse. Warm sunlight reflected softly across the polished wooden table between us while distant traffic drifted through the waterfront air outside. The board asked why Sterling Vale trusted you more than Halbrecht. Daniel admitted quietly after several moments of silence. I stirred my coffee slowly while ferries moved across the river beyond the glass windows. And what did you tell them? Daniel looked toward Manhattan's skyline shimmering beneath the late afternoon light. I said we spent years treating institutional trust like administrative support. Outside, sunlight reflected across the water, while the financial district glowed gold against the fading sky. For the first time since the live termination call, Daniel finally understood the difference between authority and credibility. One can be announced publicly during meetings. The other takes decades of quiet consistency before clients trust it enough to place hundreds of millions of dollars behind your name. And once that trust leaves a company, it rarely comes back the same way again. By late April, spring sunlight stretched warmly across Manhattan, while cherry blossoms lined parts of the Hudson River walkway beneath clear blue skies, and calm afternoon air drifting through Lower Manhattan. From the windows of Armitage Global's executive offices overlooking the financial district, the city looked softer now compared to the cold winter week when Halbrecht Capital publicly destroyed its own credibility during a live acquisition call. Nearly 2 months had passed since the Sterling Vale deal officially closed under Armitage's governance structure, and Wall Street had already moved on to newer headlines, newer mergers, newer executives trying to convince investors they controlled the future. But inside enterprise legal circles, people still quietly referenced the story whenever younger leadership confused visibility with trust. Halbrecht Capital survived financially, at least publicly. The company still occupied its towering glass headquarters overlooking the Hudson River. The lights still glowed across executive floors every evening. Investor reports still projected stability during quarterly earnings calls. But something fundamental inside the company had changed permanently. Several institutional clients gradually shifted acquisitions elsewhere during the following months, while governance reviews tightened around executive decision-making. Daniel Cross officially resigned 6 weeks after the Sterling Vale transition finalized. No scandal. No dramatic collapse. Just a carefully worded departure statement citing leadership restructuring initiatives. Corporate language always sounds polite when companies bury avoidable disasters beneath public relations strategy. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, Armitage Global expanded quietly beneath stable leadership and calm operational confidence. Sterling Vale renewed its long-term strategic partnership during the first quarter review, while additional enterprise clients requested continuity frameworks modeled after the governance structures. Vivian Mercer spent decades refining inside conference rooms most executives barely remembered after meetings ended. Funny how invisible work becomes priceless only after institutions lose it publicly. One warm Thursday evening, sunlight reflected gold across the Hudson River, while ferries drifted slowly between Manhattan and New Jersey beneath soft spring skies. Inside a quiet waterfront restaurant in Hoboken, several younger associates from Armitage celebrated the successful completion of another international acquisition, while laughter and conversation filled the room beneath warm amber lighting and open windows facing the river. One younger attorney asked me softly during dinner, "Did you always know Section 11 would stop the acquisition?" I smiled faintly while watching the Manhattan skyline glow across the water beyond the restaurant windows. Section 11 was never designed to stop deals, I answered calmly. It was designed to protect clients when leadership stopped protecting stability. Around the table, several younger associates fell silent because they understood something important in that moment. Institutional trust does not appear suddenly during negotiations. It forms slowly over years through consistency, restraint, and quiet accountability. Nobody notices while everything works correctly. Most executives spend careers trying to look powerful inside conference rooms. Very few spend enough time becoming trustworthy once meetings end. Later that evening, I walked alone beside the Hudson River, while warm spring wind moved softly across the waterfront and Manhattan shimmered beneath thousands of glowing lights across the dark water. The city looked exactly the same as it had during that winter afternoon inside Halbrecht's acquisition suite. Same skyscrapers. Same boardrooms. Same executives rushing between towers carrying presentations and forecasts and promises about the future. But one thing had changed permanently. Somewhere inside those buildings, younger leaders now understood that institutional credibility cannot be replaced through branding campaigns or executive speeches. Once trust walks quietly out the door. I stopped briefly beside the river railing while ferries moved slowly across the water beneath the glowing skyline. 23 years earlier, an older partner once told me something during my first major acquisition review. Clients never remember the loudest person in the room, he said. They remember the one who made them feel safe signing the contract. Back then, I thought he was teaching me about negotiations. Standing there beneath the spring Manhattan skyline years later, I finally realized he had actually been teaching me about leadership. Because contracts are never built from signatures alone. They are built from trust long before anyone reaches the final page. And the moment a company forgets that, the paperwork stops mattering.